So, welcome everyone. I am here with my friend Todd and my friend Chris Green, Bishop Green. Both of you guys are in Oklahoma, where I hear it has snowed.
It has, yeah.
Chris, I was thinking about trying to have a conversation with you specifically, um, because I'm the preacher in residence for the Iowa Preachers Project. This Lilly Grant project,
Yeah.
and one of the people in our second cohort this year is a friend of yours, Chris Brewer.
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course.
And our cohort this year is twice as big as our inaugural cohort, and there's a lot more ecclesial diversity among the group. And so Chris, being from an Anglican Wesleyan perspective, was asking good questions, um, and I thought it would be good to throw your voice in there, um, in terms of how we think about um, God's word, the gospel, um, the will of God, Luther's bondage of the will, all the
Oh, yeah,
stuff
yeah.
that gets wrapped up in all of that.
And
And so, yeah, I've been rereading Bonhoeffer's Ethics and rereading Charles Marsh's biography of Bonhoeffer, um, and and so I wanted to just to start with you unpacking for people how it is that Bonhoeffer, who is a Lutheran, nevertheless, particularly as he starts preaching in London, um, just kind of becomes very adamant that the will of God is both clear and pursuable.
yes. Doable. Like, it's the will of God, and therefore it can be done, right?
Hmm.
It's one of Jensen's axioms that, what will be eschatologically can be experientially now.
Mm.
So the way he puts it is, what will be can be. And that, so when we're praying the Lord's Prayer, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, like, we're not blowing smoke.
Mm. Hmm.
We're actually asking God to make it so that this will happen in our lives, in the lives of the people around us, for the sake of the people around us in the world. And he's the one who taught us to pray that. So it's not, again, it's not smoke, it's not noise like that. And that's what I think Bonhoeffer recognizes. It's the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, that trains him in, Jesus said this is what we should want, and he wouldn't want us to want it if it weren't a gift he meant for us to receive, a way of life he meant us to live. So we can know the will of God, and we can do it.
Can
And
you?
this is the basis of all of his preaching and pastoral care, and his theology, for what it's worth.
You know, whenever I hear the phrase "cheap grace" thrown around, it makes me convinced that the pastors using it haven't actually read much Bonhoeffer. So can we assume that people only know him as the guy who wrote Discipleship, and has this made for Hollywood tragic story? Can you kind of fill in for people his experience in the U.S., how the Sermon on the Mount becomes important to him, and then how that emerges in his writing and preaching when he
Yes, I
gets
mean,
back?
you've mentioned the Marsh book already. People should read that for sure. They should look at Reggie Williams' book on Bonhoeffer and the Harlem Renaissance called Black Jesus. The There's a ton of good work around Bonhoeffer's life. I mean, there's a lot of bad work too. Bonhoeffer's one of those people who's too well known for our good.
Hmm.
Like, he's famous, and it's no fault of his own. But even in his own life, and shortly thereafter, he was something of a celebrity. But as happens to any celebrity, he gets cut down to size in that kind of exaggerated sense of importance, by the exaggeration of his importance. And Bonhoeffer is, more than anything else, he's a pastor and a preacher, right?
Hmm.
I think he's a quite able theologian. I think he's underrated as a theologian by other theologians, but he is a pastor and a preacher, and a trainer of pastors and preachers. And he's here in the U.S. twice, and his experience specifically, he has the experience of kind of mainline Protestantism in New York and outlying areas. He traveled a lot anyway, and he traveled a lot while he was here. And what he found there in those kind of mainline Protestant churches was a Christianity he didn't recognize. I mean, a lot of the things we've heard said about his experience relate specifically to that kind of conventional Protestant Christianity in the early 1900s. The first,
Or, yeah,
late,
like he writes to, I think, a friend or family there's some line about how Christians in America will preach about everything but Jesus.
anything but Jesus. That's exactly right. That's exactly what he says. And this is a country that a Christianity that the Reformation did not reach. Right. So he for him, again, when he says that, though, he's thinking primarily about the prominent churches in New York and in Philadelphia, and that would have been recognizable as the go-to churches of the time.
Hmm.
And of course, American Christianity is far more diverse than that. Even then it was, and certainly now. And he then eventually has experiences like in the Abyssinian Baptist Church there in Harlem. He travels the American South, encounters Black Baptists and Black Pentecostals, and recognizes that there's a lot more happening than he first reckoned with. But it's specifically there in seminary at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in that season where he starts to take seriously the Sermon on the Mount as a way of life we're called to live, and obedience to the will of God as the heart of discipleship. And he will say himself, he does say himself, that discipleship on its own is a dangerous book. If you only
Hmm.
read that book, it's dangerous, not only because you'll misread Bonhoeffer, which is bad enough, you'll mishear the gospel, which is far worse, right? So what he's essentially saying is, do not read that book alone. Like, if you're going to read anything by me, read more than that, or you're going to have no sense of what I'm talking about. And it would be better for people not to read that book at all than to read that book only, and then to
Hmm.
kind of extrapolate out from those phrases like cheap grace, costly grace, or that the famous line. Even in translation, he's very quotable, right? So when he says things like, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die, right? Like, that's preachy. It's quotable. It's memeable, but you're not going to know what he's talking about if you meme him, right? If
Hmm.
you isolate, or anyone else for that matter. But yeah, it's one of those books that's done a lot of damage, not through the fault of Bonhoeffer, but just it's too quotable. People can take it and make it mean whatever they want it to mean. But I think it's pretty clear once you read his story and you read what else he's writing, and there's a ton of stuff, right? I mean, there are lots of books and there are lots of sermons, letters, diary, like, I don't know how many, like, is there 14 volumes in the collected work, something like that
I
Fortress
think it's like
Press has done?
17.
Oh, 17, yeah. I mean, he's writing novels and poetry. I mean, there's plenty to read, more than we can imagine, perhaps. But what you get pretty quickly is a sense of, during his time there, specifically around those Black Baptists, he realizes, wait a minute, this is the heart of the life we're called to live. To hear Jesus' voice and to respond, to do what he says.
So how you're someone who does close readings of Bonhoeffer. How does it then how does that show up in the pulpit when he gets back to Europe?
So, in a few ways, there's a astounding line. I think it's in the ethics, but I can't remember what section it's in. Yeah, it's in ethics, but I can't reference the section. But it'll be easy enough to find for people, where he says that God speaks now with the same concrete specificity as
Yeah.
when he spoke to Moses, Abraham, the prophets, as or God does not speak at all. He speaks with that same concrete specificity to us, or he doesn't. He never spoke at all, right? So, like, God is not changed. He makes his will known. He makes himself heard, and then those who hear him are by that hearing, like, summoned to obey, summoned to make, Abraham, leave your father's house.
Yeah, you actually sent me the quote. It's just as specifically as God spoke to Abraham and Jacob and Moses, and just as specifically as God spoke in Jesus Christ to the disciples and to the congregations through the apostles, so God speaks just as specifically to us, or God does not speak at all.
Or God does not speak at all, right? So you hear that line, and you of course, if you're thinking, first of all, it's a shocking line. Why is it shocking? Like, we should stop and ask ourselves, how did we ever get into a place that we thought that wasn't true?
Mm, mm,
And what
Mhm.
made us, what do we think the substitute is? Right? What are we doing if that's not what's happening? But then, of course, once we've thought about that, if we recover from thinking about that, we're going to have to ask, well, how does God do it?
mhm,
Right? I mean, I assume there are still angelic visitations, there's still prophetic inspirations. But what Bonhoeffer is convinced of is that the primary way, not the only way, but the primary way God does it is through preaching. That the the primary, and I'm looking for another word to add, not just primary, but the kind of centering way. Like, there are
mhm.
other ways, but they all come back to this, the
Yeah.
preaching of the scriptures that are given. So what you're going to have with Bonhoeffer is we have to preach the gospel. The gospel is that God has made himself known in Jesus Christ and draws us into the life of Christ so that we can live it with him. As we are preaching the gospel, we have to grapple with the assigned texts. What biblical texts are in front of us? So if that's Leviticus, or that's Numbers, or that's Psalms, or that's Romans, whatever text has been given to me to preach, I have to preach that text in a way that honors what that text is doing and brings out the gospel. And if I do that, the will of God will be known.
Mm,
What the people in the congregation need, what the congregation as a whole and people within the congregation need to know, they will know. And they will at least be positioned to begin the process of discerning what they need to discern in order to know. So he'll say, the preaching both leads to and returns to pastoral care. So if I'm preaching and you're not able to discern what God's will for you is from what has been preached, well, then that means there has to be confession of sin. There has to be pastoral conversation. There has to be perhaps extended period of discernment until you know. But the goal is to know. This is what God is asking. And Bonhoeffer's very insistent about this. God is not hiding his will. It is knowable, and we can know it. And if we don't know it, it's either because there's some sin that's blocking our knowing of it, or it's not yet time for us to know, and we need to let it come when it comes. But yeah, I mean, reading Bonhoeffer on these points for me, Jason, is kind of like, I have very little doubt that he's right. It seems to me very obvious that he's right. What what kind of always takes me back is how easy it is to shift into something else.
mhm, mhm,
And how much of the time we're living and talking and preaching and singing and praying as if God weren't still speaking, and as if God's will was something that was beside the point.
mhm.
Like, how does that happen? But it does happen. It happens to me all the time.
Because I'm thinking specifically, right? The Lutheranism that Bonhoeffer would have been raised in, and certainly the Lutheranism that then capitulated to paganism, um, would have presented the will of God as something um, to elicit your repentance and to turn to Jesus primarily as forgiver.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. It's certainly true of what would have been popular. And by the way, not just in Germany. Like Bonhoeffer was incredibly well traveled, and he saw this in lots and lots of places. The UK, the US. While he's here in the US, he takes a trip to Mexico, Cuba. He's in Spain for an extended period. So he knows, right? He's experienced a lot, and I think that's right. But he also knows that is utterly at odds with what's actually in the Lutheran tradition. So one
Mm,
one of the
mhm,
things that and I say this every time we talk, I'm sure, but like, at the end of the day, I think the the way into the wisdom of the tradition always starts with honoring what's best about the tradition that gave you the faith. So for me, that's
Mm-hmm.
Pentecostalism. I still identify as a Pentecostal, not because I think out of the whole suite of Christian traditions, that's the one I like best. Dear Lord, right? Not at all. It happens to be the one, though, that God planted me in. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
people that taught me the way of Jesus. And so I don't have a choice about that any more than I have a choice about who my parents were. That's given for me. So I think my way of being drawn into the heart of the church, the kind of the blood vessel where that starts for me, that will lead me to the heart, the capillaries for me are these classical holiness Pentecostals in the Bible Belt. That's where it starts for me. And if I can understand what they are really saying, then that will connect me to the people from whom they learn the faith. So the Anglicans, ultimately. And then if I really understand what they're doing, that will connect me and so on all the way back to the apostles and to Jesus. And I think that that's what we all have to do. I think that Bonhoeffer and Jensen are two Lutherans, that I read all the time. They did that.
Mm-hmm.
So their Lutheranism was not conventional in their time and ran at odds, not with Lutheranism per se, but with what most Lutherans thought Lutheranism is. And and that's the way in which they found the faith. And that's why they're not just Lutheran theologians, right? When you think of Bonhoeffer or Jensen, they're
Yep.
not just giving you some version of Lutheranism. Like they're doing a theology that's for the whole church. But it's precisely because
Yeah.
they
They
were
were.
Lutheran enough to know better than to trust what presented as Lutheranism around them.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. That's both of them were intentionally ecumenical in their work.
Yep. Yep.
Todd, I'm wondering, you're uncharacteristically quiet so far, Todd. I'm wondering what's rattling around in that aged mind of yours.
Well, it is aged. Um, I haven't read near as much Bonhoeffer as either of you, but I was struck by the conversation about um, Bonhoeffer's emphasis on um, knowing the will of God, and thought back to growing up as a Baptist, young Baptist boy, and the debates about how to discern the will of God, and then after at least a couple of decades, pastoral ministry, now more than that, but somewhere along the way, I, um, I guess it's okay to say, I grew a bit frustrated when it appears that there are, so let's say, Sermon on the Mount, there are some clear what's the will of God answers. And so you'd have a conversation with someone, and, they would say, "Well, I need to pray about that." Now, I understand that line, but if you're praying for clarity about what the will of God is, that's clear.
That's right.
So,
This is a really
so,
good point. Yeah,
so
yeah,
because
yeah.
so then it becomes sort of a pious Jesus juke to actually avoid what's clear, and that happened that began to happen, and so when you kind of put it that way, then it is just a shade startling to the hearer that why are we making what seems very clear difficult to hear? So, to Chris's point, and I hadn't ever really kind of thought about it in that manner, but there is a sin that needs to be confessed there. There is something in the way
Absolutely.
when what is very clear is used as well, I'm just not sure. And wait, I mean, like you may have some question about whether or not you want to do it,
Hmm.
but the issue is not about the clarity of what the will of God is.
That's right. Well, and yeah, two things to add there, and make sure I'm going to ask you guys to hold me accountable to come back to this little book, Jensen's Lutheran Slogans. Don't let me forget to do that. But I
I've got
don't
it.
want to miss this point that Todd has brought up here. So what's really really yes, it's a perfect little gem of a book. I I think what's so right about Bonhoeffer, and in my judgment, this could only come from the fact that he practiced what he preached. He was living this life.
Yep.
Because there's a kind of clarity that I think only comes when you're obedient. In the Gospel of John, we're told, the truth will set you free line. What Jesus actually says is do the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not knowing the truth, doing the truth will set you free. So you can't. There is no knowing it apart from the doing of it for John. And I think that is lost on us. That's one of the problems we have, is that we tend to think about the truth as something known, intellectually grasped, not something performed.
Mm-hmm.
And so talk about the will of God to us feels like something that comes after a very long process of thinking. And if that's our frame of mind, if that's our approach, we're going to trip ourselves up over and over again. But I want to say this about Bonhoeffer, and that I think it's so remarkable. When he says it's clear, he's not talking about generalities. He draws this right out of Luther, who was in his sermons would often talk about the difference between the general and the specific in one way or another, right? And this is why Bonhoeffer will say God hates abstractions.
Yeah.
Right? God does not work in generalities and abstractions. He works in concrete, specific moments with concrete, specific persons, and there's no in general. There's no kind of mere Christianity. There's your life with Christ in the relationships that bind you. So when Bonhoeffer says something like the will of God is clear, he doesn't mean something like Jesus tells us to forgive 70 times 7, therefore we know we have to forgive. Right? That's clear, but that's not what he means.
Mm-hmm.
What he means is, if there's someone in your life and my life, and there is, who has wronged us, the way, not only that I am to forgive them, but how I am to forgive them is clear. That the Lord has a will for how I'm to respond to, right now I'll think about, a very quickly growing list of people that have wronged me that I'm upset with. The truth is, every single one of those people that just ran through my mind, I am to forgive them. And it's not only that is clear, how I am to do it is clear if I'm willing to hear it.
Hmm.
That's how specific Bonhoeffer is being. So when he's saying that the Lord speaks with specificity, he means that. Right? So not just that God gives general rules like turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, but specifically what turn the other cheek means for me in this relationship right now based on the way this person is treating me. It's that specific. And I think saying that out loud, every time I read it or hear someone reference it or reference it myself, I have that kind of shock again of that's obviously true. Why is it surprising?
Mm-hmm.
What in the world is going on that makes us think that's not how it goes?
Right.
Right. I think, and Todd, so I think you're putting your finger, right on the nerve there.
And I don't. I mean, I think we should emphasize the fact that I'm not in any way also suggesting a generality.
No.
There is a specificity, and when you are involved in pastoral ministry and you're helping people discern, or you're proclaiming the gospel, and you're making those pastoral connections, it's not that you're in the practice of proclamation, you're not sitting there thinking about that person on the fourth row on the east side and that particular thing for them, but you are presenting things in such a way that when you do talk about turning the other cheek, the room's full.
That's right.
And so when illustrations are provided or some examples given from the text available, then we're trusting the Spirit's going to help us hear those specifically.
That's right.
Specifically.
Preaching it, yes, absolutely. I think what we need to be teaching people is, this is the word the Lord has given me to preach. You should be listening specifically for what he's asking of you.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to illustrate it in the sermon, I think there are kind of two rules to use. Don't use people in my congregation
Right.
unless they
Right.
specifically, agreed to it.
Right.
And don't always use yourself. So
Oh,
I think there
right.
there are times in which it's most appropriate to talk about how God has worked in your life. But this is specifically why I think the saints are the saints.
Mm. Mm.
And so and Jason's know this, I've talked about it with him ad nauseum, but this is why I try when I'm preaching to do to come to the pulpit, not only with whatever it is I feel like the Lord is wanting me to say, but with some sense of how the church has read these texts and some saint, at least one, who's lived this story that I can kind of point people to and say, if you don't know what I'm saying, if you're not hearing what I'm saying, look at this person's life. And like, I think that practice, and again, sometimes we can tell, your illustration can be what happened to you and your family. Probably you leave your wife and kids or husband and kids out of it,
That's right.
parents
That's
out of
right.
it. Right. But I think this is one of the reasons we need the saints. I was listening the other night, Jason, and you guys talking about Bulgakov and Mary and what you said about that's the saints are there to be imitated. That's what they're there for. That's why God has given them to us.
And they're a
And we,
reminder
we need this.
that there is, like, if all of us collectively make up Christ's body, faithfulness can't look like just any one thing.
No,
That they're all different forms of faithfulness.
absolutely right. And this is why Bonhoeffer is saying the will of God is never generally true.
Right.
Like the will of God. I'm even open to this. May be scandalous for some, but I think about. I was somebody had asked me a question yesterday, and in response, I sent them an article. Paul Griffiths talking about Edith Stein and Simone Weil, who are two Jewish women of basically the same period. Towering intellects. One of whom, and also Gillian Rose. So he's talking about these three women, all of whom are Jews. Stein, of course, converts, becomes a Christian, is martyred, uh, killed in Auschwitz or the Holocaust. Simone Weil starves to death and is never baptized. Gillian Rose has a kind of deathbed baptism conversion. So it's a kind of fascinating, and you might bring Eddie Hillesum in there as a kind of fourth figure.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at those four women, let's say, and the work of God in their life, it seems clear to me God is at work in all of them. And one of them is led right into the heart of the church and becomes a saint and may eventually be a doctor of the church. And another, Simone Weil in particular, is, at least in her mind, told she can't be baptized, that the Lord won't let her. That, she's had this encounter with Jesus in which she says, he's ravished me, but she doesn't come into the church, at least not in the way we would recognize it. It's
Mm-hmm.
certainly not like Edith Stein does or Gillian Rose at the end of her life. And I think the specificity of God's will looks like that. Here are four, I think, saintly, prophetic, wise voices, women, but their stories are in no way the same. And that, and think of that line from C.S. Lewis, right? The will of God, the more fully we live into it, the greater diversity there is, not the
Mm-hmm.
opposite. We don't, by doing the will of God, we don't all collapse into uniformity and the
Right.
sameness.
Right.
So I have a quote here from Theological Underground. Do not hide your commandments from me. This is the prayer of the pilgrim in a foreign land. There is no doubt God has given his commandments for us to know, and we have no excuse, as if we did not know the will of God. God does not allow us to live in irresolvable conflict. He does not turn our lives into ethical tragedies. Rather, he lets us know his will, demands its fulfillment, and punishes disobedience. Things here are much easier. Things here are much easier than we like. Our distress is not that we do not know God's commandments, but that we don't do them. And that as a result of such disobedience, we are gradually unable to recognize them. It is said here not that God hides his commandments, but God is beseeched for the grace not to hide his commandments. It is within God's freedom and wisdom to deny us the grace of his commandment. Then, however, there is for us not resignation, but far more urgent and persistent prayer. Do not hide your commandments from me.
Mm.
Talk a
Yeah,
little
and
bit.
for those who don't know, sorry, I know you got a question here, but for those who don't know, like you're reading from his meditation on Psalm 119, which
Mhm.
he believed was the most important thing he ever did. That's how he spoke of it. That the most important thing he ever wrote was this meditation on Psalm 119.
Mm.
And the I think I think he's likely right, at least in terms of where does what it was that he knew thanks to God. What was it? Where is it that it comes clearest? He's probably right that it's in that meditation on Psalm 119,
Hmm.
and you can get it in that Theological Underground volume.
Um, so help. So I'm thinking about Chris Brewer again,
Mhm.
who, you know, like this onslaught of like law gospel talk just hit him like a wave, and
Yeah,
talk about how we talk about holiness and sanctification, obedience, God's commands, in a way that is still promissory and not just exhortation.
good, good. Can I? Well, you guys, since it's the afternoon, I think we can probably do this. I want to be a little bit snarky, sarcastic here for just a second. Like, I think that where a lot of our trouble comes from is that, and I'll keep my focus on law and gospel, for instance. We trade in kind of pop versions of that,
Mm, mhm,
and we need we like I'm trying to be a little careful, but I don't think as a preacher, I don't actually have the right to throw around paradigms like that if I haven't spent years of understanding them.
mm,
And
mm,
it is incredibly dangerous to take my first impression of a paradigm like Lutheran law gospel because I read it off somebody's blog or heard it on TikTok and then preach with it. And that that does incredible damage to people. That incalculable damage. At the end of the day, I don't hold to the Lutheran law gospel distinction. I don't think it's a paradigm that the church needs to learn. But if you're going to use it, then go and learn it. Spend
mm,
10 years of your life reading Lutheran scholastics until you understand what they meant by it, right? And with this little book we have in front of us, right? There's a chapter in here on the proper distinction of law and gospel. Well, Jensen can write that because first of all, he was a Lutheran. He did spend decades of his life reading Lutheran scholastics as well as Luther. He did know what it was about. And guess what? He doesn't think the whole church needs to learn it.
mhm,
So I'm trusting his read of that. But here's the thing that comes with that kind of discipline. He knows what he's talking about when he talks about it. Right. Whereas if you're just trading in some kind, again, somebody's TED talk, like you don't even know what it means. And so for a lot of people, I think law and gospel means the difference between condemnation and consolation, or between the obedience and the mercy for those who are disobedient. But that's a distortion not only of the way God calls us, that's a distortion of the law and gospel paradigm. Like
mhm.
that's not at all what Lutheran tradition is actually calling for. And so I'll read just a bit from this. Um, that law and gospel must be distinguished is a corollary of justification by faith apart from works. For the gospel creates faith, and law mandates works, so that if works are one thing and faith another, so are law and gospel. Indeed, the two slogans have been, for the most part, interchangeable: law, gospel, faith, works. We could repeat here the list of uses and abuses from the first two chapters with only slight modifications of terminology, right? So he's saying we've got these distinctions for a reason: faith, works, law, gospel, but we don't really understand how they work. And he's talking by we here, he means Lutherans. Nevertheless, the mandate to distinguish between law and gospel differs in some ways, right? And then he's going to spell this out. Luther sometimes went through scripture labeling passage as one or the other to locate their function in the life of faith, that this is law and not gospel, therefore. And in his sermons, one can sometimes track transitions from one to the other. This methodological use of the slogan is surely beneficial. Preachers should indeed often pause during the preparation of a sermon and ask themselves, have I in fact presented God's law in all its stringency and the story of Christ as gospel as the unmitigated promise of God's victory over my hearers' alienation from him? Have I rhetorically managed the transition or transitions between them without blurring the one or the other? And exegetes might well regard it as a chief goal of their work to inquire into the intended impact on readers' lives of the text before them, what it demands or what it promises. But the routine can also be followed in a very wooden fashion, and then he'll talk about how you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to overuse the paradigm so that somehow the paradigm becomes the point.
Mhm.
What people should read this book and read that chapter, but this is what it distills to. We do need to know that there is a way of talking about the will of God that is law, meaning it's heard not as freeing promise, but as condemnatory demand. There is a way of talking about. Now, where this gets tricky is once you have that distinction of law gospel and you're dealing with it in kind of, cheap ways, you end up thinking law gospel maps onto Old Testament, New
Yeah.
Testament,
Yeah.
Israel and the church.
So then,
On
yeah, and then Jesus becomes the one who rescues us from the burden of being Christian.
And at the end of the day, if you take exactly right, if you take that approach, if that's how you handle it, you end up with a Jesus who's saving us from the Jews and saving us from the will of God, and ultimately, as you said, making it so that we don't have to be Christian to get the benefits. And like that's clearly a distortion. But the distortion started all the way back here when we started throwing these terms around as if we knew what they meant. I think Jensen is right. It is possible for me to preach to people in such a way that I'm actually just burdening them. I'm not directing them toward the freedom of the Spirit. I'm not directing them toward the liberty that Christ offers us, not toward promise, right? But and one of the ways that Jensen will formulate this, and he does think this is for the whole church, is that there's a difference between talking about the gospel in if-then sentences
Mhm.
and talking about the gospel in because therefore sentences, right? And that the because therefore sentences are the deeper ones.
Yeah.
Because God is and has done this, therefore this is possible, right? Again, if it will be true, it can be true.
That's what Bonhoeffer mentions that in discipleship, right? That when Jesus encounters the disciples, you know, the bridge in the other direction has been destroyed. Like they're in a new situation.
Absolutely right. And so I think, to me, law gospel is that language is more trouble than it's worth because of what people are going to associate with it. They're going to, in the same way that I think faith works language is more trouble than it's worth.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But I think the idea that my preaching can be burdensome and grueling, and everyone who's ever heard me preach is nodding yes. It can leave people with a sense of how could I ever possibly do that? And then that's bad preaching.
Mhm.
And if you want to call that law, fine, call it whatever you want. It's bad preaching because it's not actually the word of the living God that sets people free to do the will of God. But what we cannot mean when we're talking about the difference between preaching that actually gets the gospel done and preaching that doesn't is that preaching the gospel means here's how God is going to get you out of having to obey. Like that's not what's being given. You're not being given a way of, how is it that Niebuhr puts it, a Christianity without the cross. Like
Yeah.
that's not on offer. And so I think for me, it's not at the end of the day, that Lutheran paradigm is just not worth the trouble it creates. But I think if you take it seriously on its own terms in the way that Bonhoeffer and Jensen does, you can see that there is benefit to it.
Mhm.
And it is arisen for a really good reason, which is it is possible for us to moralize. It is possible for us to give advice and to talk to people about what they should be doing as Brandon Manning would say, to should all over people in such a way that they feel incapacitated and ashamed by what they're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not good preaching. But I think that's we have to be careful how we counter that, and we don't counter it with. And this is actually what Bonhoeffer means by cheap grace.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because cheap grace, as he means it, is the attempt to have Christ without the cross.
Yeah. And one of the things I appreciate about Jensen is, the doctrine of justification is not something to be preached. It's a rule for how we preach.
Yes.
That it's a way of securing that God is the main character in this story that you're being drawn into.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's another tragedy is that and here's another rant incoming. When we stopped teaching people theology, we started teaching them ministry practices. We tried to be practical. And what we did in the process is kill the spirit of our preaching. The last thing a sermon should be is practical. Like, dear God in heaven, that's the last thing it needs to be. I mean, it shouldn't be a lecture either, but I'd rather it be a lecture than be practical. Because if it's practical, it will be burdensome.
Mm.
It's
And
moralizing advice. If it's practical, it's moralizing advice. You're Dave Ramsey telling me how to save more money.
Yeah.
And if I want to watch Dave Ramsey, I'll do that on my own time. I don't come to the Eucharist to have somebody give me advice, and I don't come to give advice. Like, that's not what that's for. And I'm ranty today. Sorry about that.
No, I was going to intrude a minute ago that it seems like more and more we are comfortable with finding Christ in the Old Testament in typological ways that foreshadow the crucifixion. But I don't see as many people taking the next step that like Jesus is the one who gives the law to Moses.
That's right. This is powerful. Jensen says, the one the one in God whose finger engraved in stone. We know the one in God whose finger engraved the stone because we know the one who has the hand. Like the voice that spoke to Moses, we would recognize it, or at least Mary would have recognized it. It's Jesus is the one doing this. Like the Ten Commandments are His word, absolutely every bit as directly as the Sermon on the Mount is. And if my preaching and catechesis and pastoral care and direction, and if I'm not talking and living like that, then I have no idea what I'm talking about.
Hmm. Todd,
Yeah.
Baylor wants to know, do you think that God's will is clear? The Bonhoeffer's point there, how can it be abused and weaponized?
Like, how can it, or is it? It clearly is. Write your check.
Mm.
If you want to be, God's will is clear. The church has decided this is what we're going to do. So, I need a plane. Write your check. It can be weaponized pastorally by me telling a parishioner what I think they ought to do, because it's become clear to me, so it should be clear to you, and so it can be very abusive in that regard. So yeah, I think it can be. I think it can be abused and weaponized. Yeah.
So, Chris, help. I'm sure I immediately thought of it, so I'm sure there's going to be other people who think of such things. I saw on social media earlier today, I think David Fitch shared a picture of an incomplete nativity scene out in front of a church, where it just had like a card saying that the Holy Family had been taken by ICE, something like that. And so how do you, like, how do you recommend that pastors, preachers, and just and Christians think about these instances where we could say the will of God on this particular subject is clear. But then how do we proclaim that, discern it for ourselves in a way that doesn't perpetuate cultural antagonisms?
Yeah. Yeah. So great question. And lots and lots and lots of thoughts here. And whatever I say won't be enough. There's always a lot more nuance that needs to be added.
Because I just want to say, like, too, part of the problem with Bonhoeffer existing as like a pop figure in people's heads is if you just read his sermons, you wouldn't necessarily extrapolate his biography
That's right.
from those sermons. And
I think
same with Karl Barth.
I think that's a good thing though. And there, a kind of number that no man can number of threads I want to try to thread together here. But one of the threads is this is the difference between the clergy and the laity that we need to recover, which is we need fewer pastors popping off about cultural issues and more laypersons speaking up.
Mm. Mm.
Because the pastor's responsibility is for the congregation and for the tradition. The individual Christian has more freedom than that. They don't have to worry about holding a congregation together and remaining faithful to the whole tradition at once. They don't have to worry about that. That's not their job. So,
And another way of putting that too it's I can't. It's my job to proclaim this text, in a way that's clear to you, Chris, the layperson. I shouldn't short circuit your calling to discern God's will for you.
absolutely right. And God's will for you to speak to other people, right? So, like, again, there's a number no man can number here, but just one of the threads is if, as a pastor, I stick with what I'm called to do, preaching this text to the whole congregation, living with them and serving them in such a way that they can hold together and hold together around the table in prayer, then individuals within the community have more room to do what they can do. So they can weigh in on things in a way I'm not going to weigh in on them. So at least I'm not going to be able to weigh on them as a pastor in the pulpit. So if I go online, so here's another thread to introduce. I don't know if it's possible to be a pastor and be on social media and share on social media your personal opinions without that undermining what you're trying to say as the voice of the church when you preach.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit the heart button right here several times.
So, for example, I have very strong opinions about. Well, let me back up and give you an example of like David Bentley Hart, who's such a lightning rod figure. Like part of the gift of Hart is that he's not a priest, he's not a bishop, he's not a pastor.
Mhm. Mhm.
He's a public intellectual, a theologian, and a philosopher who's stirring the pot. Hauerwas is very similar to this. He's a professor. He's a theologian and a professor, a philosopher, a public intellectual. But Rowan Williams is a bishop, first of all. He's also a philosopher and a theologian, but he's a bishop. And so he talks differently.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a lot of resonance there. I mean, they of course know each other and care for each other, respect each other, but not doing the same work. And I think that Hauerwas and Hart doing what they do actually eases the burden for Rowan to do what he does and vice versa, right? So we need that. But here's the thing. Rowan doesn't have, an Instagram account where he's telling you what he thinks about immigration.
Yeah,
And I think that's, given his responsibility, I think that's wise. Because I think I'm sure if you set him down and asked him, what do you think the United States should do with their immigration policy and policing? He has ideas. And they're probably better than your ideas or mine. Like, I assume that. But that's not his function as a bishop. Now, his function as a bishop is to say, as the church, we are responsible for these people God brings into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if I'm speaking as a preacher, I don't have anything to say about the political theory what I have to say is these people God brings in front of us, the real people who come into our real lives, that's not unclear what we are to do. And there are very quickly we get to the edge of what we do and don't understand, what we do and don't have control of. But we can never think about all of those theoretical questions clearly and rightly unless concretely I'm doing the will of God for the people that show up in my life.
Mm.
And
It, uh, it is like a good indication, right, of how these memes and algorithms prey upon us that I honestly don't believe there's any church in the United States that if they had, these migrant families in their congregation, like they wouldn't just, okay, go round them up.
absolutely right.
Like,
And in experience, like I've experienced this over and over again in real life, some of the people that are most conservative politically and are quickest. I mean, I'm thinking of two people right now that are. I mean, they're more conservative than they should be. Let's put it like that. But I could tell you story after story of seeing them respond. I'm thinking, of I don't want to give anything away because they might see this sometime. But the I have more than two conservative friends though, so it's not like it's easy for
you live in Oklahoma.
people. I live in Oklahoma, exactly, and then I work in Florida. But the point is, like, I've seen these people whose politics I think are shambles love the people God puts in front of them
Yeah.
well over and over and over again.
So,
And I've seen people who I think politically they're taking the right posture, but I don't see them responding with that kind of kindness to the real people who are in front of them. And this is where I think this is the third thread. This is where I think social media is it's a cancer on our moral awareness and moral imagination because our response to those ideas and those stories or those kind of impressions, it stirs up in us moral indignation, which is essential I mean, holy anger is essential to faithfulness. But when that is constantly being provoked by things I don't really understand, by people I don't really know,
mhm.
it starts to deaden. So I'm going to connect this to like a pornography addiction or to any other kind of addiction. Like one of the things that's worse about that kind of abuse is that it deadens your humanity.
Yeah.
It makes it so that you're less capable of loving as you should love, right? And there's nothing more deadening to the soul than manufactured anger that's not concretely rooted
Yeah.
in life that I can actually respond to.
And in the same way that pornography is false intimacy, like, I think online political dialogue is empty righteousness.
Yeah, that's right. It's and what's well. Let me give a concrete example. It's how I want to try to live with it. I'll give us two examples. One, which was probably a mistake on my part, and the other that shows that I hope I've learned from it. So years ago, I had this experience. I was sitting at home. It was the story when you probably all remember this when ISIS was invading, was killing all the Christians in Iraq, not just
Hmm.
Christians, but also them. And these Yazidi women had fled to the mountains, and they were throwing their babies off the mountains and throwing themselves, in some cases, off the mountains to keep from being captured by ISIS. And there's a report about that, and I'm sitting in my living room, I'm watching it, and something happens, and I have to pause the TV. And I get up and walk away, and it's paused. I come back in. When I come back in, I had paused kind of accidentally on this photograph of a group of ISIS soldiers. And my eyes just fell on this boy. I mean, and he was a boy. I mean, he couldn't have been more than 13, 12, 13, who's in this group of terrorists. And what hits me now, even all these years later, is this sense of like compassion, but also kind of sickening anger at what in the world is happening that this boy is being co-opted into this kind of horror, this kind of
Mhm.
terror, right? Well, so I preached that Sunday not long after that, and I shared that in the sermon. And this man came up to me afterwards, furiously angry. And he had jumped to the conclusion that politically I wasn't as opposed to terrorism as I should be, and I wasn't for America. I mean, he got a lot out of my sharing of the story. Um, and at the time, I was pretty defensive. No, I don't know if defensive is right. I mean, I put him in his place, as we say. But years later, much more recently, in fact, just a few months ago, there was a story, also on the news, about a grandmother who was deported. She's back to India. She's been here was here all of her life. A grandmother who gets deported back to India, and I haven't shared that with anyone until right now. But I've asked. I took a picture of her. It's on my phone, and every time I see that picture, I pray for her. And now much more. I don't even know her name. I don't want to know her name. Like I want to. I mean, I do eventually, but like the way that I have received it is rather than getting angry about that story and posting about it, I'm going to take this woman and she's one of my sisters, one of my mothers and grandmothers. I'm going to pray for her every time I see her picture. And now, much more often than seeing it, I'm thinking of her and praying for her. Right.
Mm.
I think that that's a little bit of me learning how to respond to all of these inputs.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right. So for my clergy, and if any of them hear this, I want to remind them of it. Like, I think there is a place for righteous indignation in our preaching, but it better be filtered and filtered and filtered and filtered through prayer.
Mm.
And it cannot be, especially if we're young, and all of us are, it can't be knee jerk.
Mhm.
Right. But if you're not a pastor, there's more room. You can be more spontaneous in those kinds of
I
groups.
mean, that's really good. That like
Yeah.
if your pastor doesn't preach about X next Sunday, like, well, I mean, what you're saying is there's not enough days in the week to pray on that in order to preach well on it.
I have too many tears to shed over that person, over what's happened, not over that thing or that issue, over these people
Right.
to rush. Like that's not, but again, there may be, so again, if you're a public intellectual, you're a poet, you're an artist, you're a celebrity of some kind, that's a different set of responsibilities. I'm only talking right now about people who feel called to
Yeah.
pastor, who've been entrusted with that, right? So I think that there there are others who have the rules are slightly different for them because they're in a different place. They're doing different work. So I'm not saying this for every Christian everywhere, obviously. And again, some pastors, because of where they pastor and their congregation and their calling, they have more room, either because they're more mature or because they've lived through more. If someone like Eugene Peterson in the golden years of his life, if he wants to get up and talk about some quote unquote issue,
Mhm.
he's earned that right. Now, he's also one of those who's least likely to do it in any ranty, off the cuff way.
Yeah.
But I think we have to leave room for, individual differences. Again, there needs to be a lot of nuancing here. But in general, if you're called to be a pastor, you're called to mostly to keep your mouth shut and pray. It's like that's
and
mostly what you're called to do.
and I think to bring it back to Bonhoeffer, one of the things you're pointing to is I was just rereading some of Bonhoeffer's Advent sermons from London, and one of them, he says, like, our problem is we don't want it to be true that God is present to us in the world. um, and what you're describing, Chris, your act of praying for this individual woman, um, well, that doesn't make any sense at all unless God is present in the world, working His will in ways that we can't see.
That's right.
To just go one person at a time is irresponsible. If we're alone in the universe.
Yeah, and like part of, and I think what inspired me was years ago reading Origin. Celsus makes this critique of the Christians that they're not patriotic because they don't join in the fights.
Mm-hmm.
And Origen's like, oh, no, we do far more for the victory of our peoples by prayer than could ever be done with a sword. And either we believe that or we don't.
Right.
Like
Right.
either or we don't.
Right.
That. Either we think there is a living God and a company of heaven of saints and angels and a church that absolutely is forming what's real for people, or we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, then yeah, you're gonna have to get violent.
Wow. It's good.
Well, what didn't I ask you, Chris, that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I don't know. That's a dangerous thing to ask me, Jason. I hope people will track down the Psalm 119 meditation and grab this little book by Jensen. If they're interested in these questions, they need to read that.
Yeah, I can. I'll post this excerpt from it. When I have the video posts.
I can feel like on the other side of all that rant energy that I had, this is why I was saying like all kinds of nuances have to be layered in here and added in. So let me say, I think, like as a pastor, and in my case also as a bishop, like I don't want what I'm saying online in a conversation with you to create a distortion unnecessarily, right? Or a distortion not of what we're called to. So I think if anyone's kind of incensed by it, what I've said here, do this. Take a year, pray about it, like discern the will of God, what God is asking of you, and then in a year or so, reach out to me and let's talk about it. And like I'm open to that. Like I'm not trying to be right about it all, but this is not my idea. Like I think this is the oldest wisdom there is in the church. Like being faithful to God is a lot about stomaching what's happening, suffering what's happening prayerfully over a long haul. Just yesterday, we were in our study of Corinthians, and Cherith V. Nordling shared from her dad, Gordon Fee's meditations on Paul's ethics, 1 Corinthians 13, astounding passage Gordon did on 1 Corinthians 13, reflecting on what he had learned over the years of his life, teaching it and writing about it, and specifically writing the Corinthian commentary. And one of the things he points to is, the kind of standard translation now that love is patient. Like he's like, this completely misses the point of what Paul is saying. He says we're much closer if we think of it as love suffering long, which is what the King James has. He's like, but the key point is that love does something. Love is doing love.
Mm-hmm.
And what it's doing first is it's enduring, it's suffering long. And out of that comes everything else, right? Out of that comes the kindness. And then, the not keeping of records of wrongs and so on down.
That's a much better wedding sermon.
Yes, it is. So the main thing I want people to hear me saying is on all of this front, of course, we do need to be involved. We do need to care. It does matter that we vote and that we are engaged. This is not some kind of sectarian, Benedict option that I'm calling for, or being so heavenly minded we're no earthly good, right? This is one of the things that's astonishing about Jesus. No one ever thought he was heavenly minded. That was not, he got himself killed, and you don't get killed if you're heavenly minded, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not at all calling for some kind of piety. I'm saying if we really care about these people and what's being done to them, and now I'm talking specifically about immigration and all of that, if we really care about those people, then that looks like long-suffering, prayerful cooperation with God, and letting him show us concretely how to respond specifically to the people around us so that difference can be made, and trust him through prayer with those larger shifts that need to be made in the world and in policy and in who gets elected, the kings that get raised up and get taken down. All of that matters, but it's not under my control. What is under my control is how I let my heart respond to what I hear and what I let my mouth say.
yeah, I've thought about, like, um, what does it say about the church that so many Christians don't care? Like, and
Yes. Yes.
like, what have we not been teaching people about the nature of baptism and who their baptism joins them to,
Yes.
um, as fellow members of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And
I mean, Marilyn Robinson said something when I was with her a few weeks ago at the conference in Michigan, the doxology conference, and she said, "Listen, there are some things," and she mentioned immigration as one. She's like treating migrant, immigrant, refugee, quote unquote illegals inhumanly. Like, I don't have room for that. That is a sin, and I think she's right. I think
yeah,
saying that is right. Treating any person under any circumstances inhumanly, whether they're a prisoner, a terrorist, someone who's being subjected to torture, a prisoner of war, an inmate, an immigrant, illegal or whatever, like treating someone inhumanely is sin. Christians can't do it. Now we can disagree about what the most humane response is in any given situation. Obviously, I'm not going to answer those questions. I can't answer them all. But what it has to start with is this flesh and blood person in front of me. Do I recognize that this is Jesus?
and that's right. That's the loop to get to like gospel and not just
Yes.
purgatory.
Yes. That's right. And yeah, exactly. Not so right. Even righteous indignation doesn't bring about the kingdom of God. We have to feel it, but it itself isn't going to do. It isn't going to liberate.
Right.
I do think we desperate. In fact, I think we need more righteous indignation, and this is precisely why I'm opposed to online raging. Not because I'm afraid of anger, not because I don't think anger is good. We desperately need holy anger. We will never get to holy anger if I'm venting. Like, you can't get there from here.
Mhm. That's good. And reading Bonhoeffer again, as I said, like the the frequency with which joy comes up, right?
He's a theologian of joy.
That,
That's
like,
exactly right.
I mean, he's preaching and living at a time where like you could expect him to be just completely animated by righteous anger, but he wasn't.
That's right. And that's exactly right. And I think that's why, again, we need, and not that Bonhoeffer's a saint, but we need saints and people like the saints to show us this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. And out of control raging, mouthing off online is just, that ain't it. Like, that's just not it. Especially if you're a pastor. Like, that's just not it.
So, as a bishop, not to name, you know, I don't want you to throw anyone under the bus, but do you find yourself having to check in with the clergy under your care and be like, hey, you might want to tamp that down a little bit?
Not much, too much. I mean,
Okay.
I think I'm really lucky. I'm the luckiest bishop in the world, honestly, or one of the top 10. I've got a really good group, but there have been some of that, but not much. But I mean, I I I think part of the reason it's not there is the bishops before me and around me set set that precedent, you know, which is part of the reason I'm in that role. I wouldn't be in that role if it weren't for them and weren't for that culture being set.
Yeah, I do see bishops in my own denomination piping off on social media and like you just sound like my mom right now. It's there's something
And,
about the office that should be different.
I'm beating a dead horse, and my phone's probably going to die. I'm not getting raptured if I'd suddenly disappear, or struck dead, which is more likely. But um, again, sometimes more power to your mom. Like, I think they're like, for me, the line between those who have been, put in a collar. My son calls this my leash. He called it this when he was little kid, and I love it. Like, to be ordained means that I don't get to lead with what I think.
Mm, yeah,
I don't get. I lost
yeah,
that. Like, when that stole went around me, I lost the right to say whatever I think about anything. I have those thoughts,
that's really good.
but that's not what God has asked me to do. I have a burden that, my mouth is shut on some things, at least in terms of what I can say publicly. And that my mouth can only open in prayer then and in counsel. And if we could recover that, then other people like your mom sound off. If you like, if you're like, I don't have a problem with there being people like Hauerwas or David. Like, we need more of those people who are willing to say hard things and confront people. But 20 and 30 and 40-year-old pastors doing it online is not the way to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what I'm pushing back against.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Probably not even 60-year-olds.
Well, I'm going to leave that for somebody else to say. But I mean, like, those of us who are under 50, and pastors, we need to be practicing an entirely different discipline.
Well, Chris, before your phone dies, I want to thank you for recommending Task to me. I want to thank you for your time here. We saw Rental Family on Thanksgiving, and it was really good.
Haven't seen it yet, but I will.
And surprisingly theological. I wasn't expecting that.
Ken Tanner says the new Knives Out is incredible, so I want to see that.
He is like an evangelist for that movie.
Yes, he is.
I love that, man. And I love you all. Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Likewise.
Talk to you soon.